All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. We have a very special show today. We are doing a deep dive into kind of a midseason review of the Los Angeles Lakers mixed with a trade deadline preview with my buddy Jovan Buha. We're going to get into a bunch of good stuff today. Jovan, how are you, man?
I'm doing well, Jason. Thank you for having me. Excited to be on.
It's good to see you. We are actually recording this on Thursday. I think you guys are going to be seeing this on Saturday, but we're recording this on Thursday after a win against the Miami Heat. Jovan and I were joking before the show about how precarious things looked at the end of the first half yesterday. I'll say, though, having gone back and watched the film, I didn't think they played terribly in that first half. It was kind of an extension of the funk that they've been in. And honestly, I thought that second half was one of their best stretches of basketball this season in terms of execution on both ends of the floor. And that kind of is the way that I would wrap up this entire Lakers season to this point, is a combination of extremely frustrating lack of commitment to those details and then some pretty basketball when it all comes together. And so I want to kind of start big picture. And I want to start before we even get into any actual traits about the team. Where do you think the team is at mentally right now in terms of this up and down season? You have this crazy hot start with this crazy low, peaking with that Miami loss on the road to a nice resurgence to a 3-game losing streak, this trade for Dorian Finney-Smith that sends D'Angelo Russell out, and now we have this win against the Heat. Where do you think this team is at mentally right now?
I think they're in uncomfortable growth period right now because against the Heat, there were some very interesting comments publicly from this group. We spoke with Max Christie at Shoot Around, and he talked about how disconnected they've been, particularly on the defensive end. And he put it more on the players than the coaching staff. He's like, we know what we're running defensively, just for whatever reason, we're quiet out there. We don't communicate well. We're not on the same page, and we botch a bunch of basic stuff. And you can tell when we're connected, we look really good, and we can be a good defensive team. When we're not, you can also tell, and we're a pretty bad defensive team. So I thought that was a pretty revelatory statement from a starter on this team, and just admitting that this group is not on the same page right now, and that it's something that they've been talking about and trying to address. Then after the game, you have JJ Redick just come out and say they had a team meeting at Shoot Around, and he challenged this group from a leadership perspective. And he's talked about several times this season that this is more of an introverted group. They are quiet. They don't necessarily have that commanding vocal leader. It tends to be LeBron, but outside of him, the rest of the group is pretty, more to themselves. So JJ talked about if you guys aren't going to lead vocally, you at least need to lead by example, lead with diving on the ground for loose balls, your defensive rotations, crashing the offensive glass, doing the little things on the floor that lead to winning basketball. And you guys have not done that enough lately. So I thought you saw that, especially in that second half, that the group really led by example and everyone was locked in. They're playing serious basketball, as you like to say. And then the final thing was AD, I think pretty much summed it up, where he was like, whether we're up or we're down, we have to stop being front runners. And I think there's been that kind of front runner energy at times with this group, where when they're up, everyone, it's all kumbaya, everyone's happy, that they're, the spirit's great. But when they're down, everybody separates. And you've seen that. How many times this season have they had a second half where they just get absolutely smacked and end up losing a game by 20, 25, 30 points? That's the reason why their point differential, net rating are so bad, despite being above 500, is because they have these just god-awful second halves. So I think right now they're in this growth period of trying to figure out the new rotation, trying to figure out the way that they've adjusted offensively and defensively without D'Angelo Russell. But it's been uncomfortable at times. There's been some tension. There's been some disconnection. And right now, as we're recording this, they're 3-4 post DFS trade. And I think they were expecting to be better than that. And they're 29th in defense over this stretch. I think they were supposed to be better defensively, but right now I feel like they're trending in the right direction temporarily. But with this team, as we know, it's kind of a week-to-week team.
That's why I wanted to start with the mental element, because there's a certain amount of self-awareness that is important in all walks of life. But an important piece of self-awareness for this Lakers team is that they are not the most talented team in the NBA. That is the first thing you have to acknowledge. NBA history tells us that you don't have to be the most talented team to win the title. I think even as recently, a great example is the 2022 Warriors. I don't think they were the most talented team in the league, and they won the title. There's a lot of different ways that you can create opportunity for yourself through the commitment to those details. The reason why the commitment to the details is so important is like what you're talking about. Those moments where the Lakers have a 10, 15 point lead, but they kind of squander it down and end up barely scraping out a win with a couple of big shots from LeBron late. Or it's the game where they fall down by 10, and instead of rebounding back from that, they just give up and lose by 25. That's where the commitment to habits and details will carry you. Like, there is a certain floor that every basketball team can have just simply through effort and execution. If you're just in the right spots on defense all the time, and you compete physically for every loose ball, and on offense, you sprint into your cuts, you set solid screens, you get to the right spot on the floor, and you execute your offense properly. If you do all of those things, you will give yourself a chance to fight back even when things aren't going your way. And so, like, when you get up 15, if you continue to do those things, even if they're playing more desperate than you should at least kind of hang on, right? When you're down by 15, if you're at least doing all of those things, you should be able to hang on to the rope. And when they lose desperation, you'll gain some ground on them. It is a basketball character thing that is absolutely necessary. And the reason why I asked you about this is like a non-negotiable for this team if they want to get to where they want to go. I heard JJ talk about, I don't want to coach a good team. I want to coach a great team. You and I talked about this on your pod the other week or last week. LeBron comes out after I think it was after the Houston loss. I want to be a great team. I thought Steph Curry's comments after the game last night when he was like, if you guys think I'm okay, like leading an average team, you're insane. And like, that's step one is be committed to the work. Once we accomplish that, then we can shift to the big picture and talk about strengths and weaknesses of the team, how to address these sorts of things. But there is a decision that has to be made. And last night is not the first time this season that they've made this decision. Like, hey, tonight we're going to do it, guys. That's not the first time they've made that decision. It was jarring to watch, Jovan, the difference in the way they were defending when they got into like precarious switches compared to the games against San Antonio, the games against Dallas, where like Austin gets Bam's got Austin in the post. Instead of everyone standing around, LeBron hard double teams, and they're in position off that. Max was really bad defensively in the first half, and he ended up losing Tyler Herro on that play. But they were at least offering support. There was a peel-off switch. There's again, JJ talked about, we're not going to do 1-5 switching or that was just a game plan specific thing for the Spurs and for Dallas. Okay, we're going to do less switching tonight. Well, Bam sets a monster screen. Suddenly it ends up having to be a switch. He buries Max in the post. Instead of just standing there, Rui stunts. Anthony Davis stunts. They offer him support. They force Bam to pump fake. He ends up missing a hook shot. Like, this team is capable of doing the things that JJ is asking them to do. They just have to do it. And so, again, it's not about one game, and this is why we can't ever react to any one game. Step one, before we go any further with this team, what they did last night needs to be their journey. It needs to be what they do on a daily basis to maximize the talent that they have on this team. From the football playoffs to college and pro basketball to the rush of hockey, what a time to be a sports fan. It's all happening, and you can get in on all the action of all the sports you love at DraftKings Sportsbook. With so many sports, every day is game day at DraftKings. That means unlimited opportunities to place your first bet, and DraftKings makes it easy. How easy? Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app and pick your team and place your bet. One of my favorite bets to look at right now is the NBA championship picture. I have 3 teams in the same tier. I have Boston, Oklahoma City, and Cleveland all in the same tier. But Boston's at plus 250, the Thunder at plus 265, the Cavs are at plus 1100. So some nice value there. And to help get you started, here's something special for all new customers. Bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code HOOPS. That's code HOOPS, that's HOOPS, for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. DraftKings, the crown is yours. The pivot point that I see for the deadline, and this is where I want to kind of shift gears towards what we can expect in February. I see two different directions that the Lakers can go. Option number one is anchor LeBron, Anthony Davis, and Austin with two-way athletes. And the way that this would manifest is like an upgrade at the two. Basically, I thought Max was pretty rough in the first half yesterday. Max is a very up and down player because he's a young player. So that's to be expected. You have more of a rock solid option so that Max can be a backup, but still play 20, 25 minutes, get his reps, but not be someone that you depend on. And that requires what you saw at the end of the game. That requires LeBron to be hitting tough right shoulder fades, hitting little elbow jump shots and pick and roll, Austin to hit shots like that. It leaves the onus on LeBron and Austin to do enough offensively. Option two is to get super aggressive on the shot creation star front, which is like, let's go get a Zach LaVine, let's go get a Brandon Ingram, let's go get a Collin Sexton, let's go get a Jordan Poole, whoever that is, right? Which direction do you think the front office is leaning? And I should include too, before I pitch this to you, the role player element probably includes them potentially hunting for a backup center if that's something they choose to do. But which direction do you think the front office is leaning more towards at this point? And where are you leaning at this point?
So I'm leaning toward the former option. You and I have spoken about Bruce Brown as a potential option that we think would make a lot of sense with this group. And I look at the 2020 model, not necessarily from the big man perspective, but the put a bunch of two-way perimeter players around LeBron and AD, have those guys be relatively interchangeable from a skill set perspective. And, if you can think about DFS and Max next to LeBron, AD, Austin, or DFS and Bruce Brown, or Max and Bruce Brown. And there's so many combinations. Vando, when he gets back, obviously leans more defensive than offensive, but the Lakers started to use him in some interesting ways last season before the injury in Boston. So I like that model more than the latter. I think the playmaking, there's been some growing pains with Austin as he has transitioned to being a full-time point guard, but he also had a performance like last night where 14 assists, 1 turnover, and what was just dissecting the Heat's zones. So I thought there's going to be matchups where Austin struggles, and I do think there's some overlap between Austin and LeBron in terms of the matchups where they both struggle, where athletic teams that can put pressure on the ball can affect both of those guys. And that's when you'll see higher turnover games and them not being as necessarily efficient offensively. But those are also the types of teams that D'Lo would struggle against. So if they do go out and get another playmaker, I think it would have to be a different kind of player archetype than the one that they previously had. But I think they're going to lean more the playmaking route between those two paths. That is my sense currently. I know in conversations with people around the team in the fallout of the DFS trade, one thing that they wanted to evaluate was the playmaking, and if there was a bit of a hole there after trading D'Lo. And I think there has been. I think that the playmaking overall has probably been fine, but there have been some stretches where they've struggled. And I don't even think it's necessarily making a wholesale change of bringing in a new starting point guard or a new primary ball handler. I think it's more so just like they could just use a third reliable ball handler, playmaker, initiator, even if it's like a bench player. So that could, like we talked about Bruce Brown as a guy who kind of checks a couple boxes where he does have some history being that type of guy off the bench in Denver. And then he also, is a type of two-way wing that he can kind of check a couple of those boxes. Cause I think the Lakers have 3 holes right now, and I don't know how realistic it is to check all of them. But in terms of playmaking versus two-way wings, I think that the wing acquisition was probably DFS, and they're looking more toward a backup big or a playmaker.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I agree with you that there's 3 holes. I would say that the backup center hole is a hole that most teams in the NBA have. And there are these teams out there where it's like teams like Dallas is a good example. I think another example is like Detroit with Jalen Duren and Isaiah Stewart, where it's like you almost feel like you have 2 starting centers, and then they do like both of them play like 24 minutes ish, and they just play their asses off the entire time they're out there. that's a great luxury. I don't want to sit here and pretend like that wouldn't be super helpful to have like a Walker Kessler that would be able to come in for 20, 25 minutes a night and play really high level center and help the team. But that's a weakness that like quite literally almost every team in the league has, except for a couple of others. It mainly just because there's just not that many good centers in this league, and most of the backups come with gaping holes. Like I always think it's funny when I'm listening to Bucks fans, and it's like, we just need to have a center that can defend. And I want to be like, yeah, you're right. Bobby Portis sucks at defense, and bringing in a center that can defend would really help. But Bobby Portis is also really good at offense, and whatever guy you bring in that's better at drop coverage and tracking guys around is probably going to be a guy that janks things up for your offense on the other end of the floor, because that's just the type of player that you're dealing with there, right? Now, when it comes to the shot creation versus the athletic support debate, I think it comes down to discussing what level you can get to on either end of the floor. And when I start thinking about the Lakers trying to outscore people, what I get worried about is like, can they outscore Denver? I don't know. I don't know that they can. Let's say they get out of the conference. Can you outscore Cleveland? Can you outscore Boston? Can you like that's it, yeah. It's I'm worried about like, oh, like let's say they got Zach LaVine, which by like those hot super high salary guys are just really difficult to match. But I think Zach LaVine is a really shoe-in offensive fit with this team. It would be an obvious offensive upgrade. Like, do I think Zach LaVine, LeBron, AD, and Austin is going to outperform offensively the top offenses in the league? I don't know. However, I do think, because I've seen it, that LeBron and Austin and AD can scale up offensively a certain amount in the postseason to where they have a puncher's chance to compete on that side of the floor. But if you anchor them defensively, I actually think there's a level this team can get to defensively when they're engaged. And I know this sounds, frankly, just ridiculous because of how bad they've been defensively this year. But in theory, an engaged Anthony Davis, an engaged LeBron, an engaged Dorian Finney-Smith, an engaged, let's call it Bruce Brown, and an engaged Austin Reeves that is committed to the details and builds out the habits necessary within JJ Redick's defensive scheme, I think they can hit a really high defensive level while also having a certain offensive upside because of LeBron and Austin and AD. And so there's a risk both ways, right? If you go after a playmaker, it's possible that you're just not good enough defensively and you can't outscore people. If you go all in on a athletic support type of player, then you have a shortcoming in playmaking, shot creation that we've talked about that I agree with you that has manifested since the D'Lo trade. There's holes both ways. But the defensive hole for going for a role player, there's nothing in-house that can scale up and cover for that. Whereas Austin and LeBron might just make shots. And if they do, maybe you win the whole damn thing. That's where I look at it, where like there's a certain scalability with like, what if LeBron and Austin, like for instance, last year in the first round series, I thought LeBron and AD were awesome. That wasn't the issue. I didn't think shot creation was the issue. I thought the issue was they weren't supported athletically the way they needed to be. If Denver scored every time down the floor in game 2 and in game 5 down the stretch, you get stops on 30% of those possessions, you're up 3-2 in the series against the defending champs. And I think they match up really well against Minnesota. So like, it's one of those things where it's flawed either way. And so we go back to my original question, which is like, if this team commits to the work, that's step one, which flawed path is more likely to lead to the promised land? And I think anchoring them with athletic support has the upside of LeBron and Austin versus anchoring them with offensive support has the downside of them just not having enough defensive talent to get the job done. So that's where I lean at this point. But let's start talking about some specifics. And before we get into the trade, the actual trade market, where is like Vando at in his return at this point? Do you think his return is imminent, or do you think we're still a few weeks out?
I would say relatively imminent. JJ said that early next week there's going to be an update in terms of a more concrete timetable. So that to me typically is when a team gives a timetable, it's like a 7 to 10 day on the short side. So I would expect Vando to potentially be back in the next couple of weeks on the shorter side. One challenge they've had right now is that they're trying to find scrimmage reps for him, but the team has not been practicing. They are practicing Thursday. The G League team has been out of town, so he was getting some reps with South Bay. But
do they not have a get ready group anymore that they're traveling with?
They do. So he's been doing it with the coaching staff, but they want him to get actual 5-on-5 reps with the team and see what it looks like and ramp that up. So maybe like the end of next week on the very early side, but I would suspect it probably goes into the following week. But that then gives you like a week and a half to evaluate this group. And JJ's already said he's going to be on a minutes restriction to start at about like 10 to 15 minutes. So you don't really get the sample size that you want, because that's been a big thing for them, has been saying, we want to get Vando back. We want to get Christian Wood back. We want to see what this group looks like healthy, so we can because right now, sure, it looks like we need another wing defender, but maybe Vando is simply that wing defender. Like, it looks like we need a better backup 5. Maybe Christian Wood is that better backup 5, but we don't know if we're going to see those guys back before the trade deadline. So they might just have to make a call as to, what do we think this group looks like? What do we think the holes are? And how do we plug that?
What's your best guess with Christian Wood?
Christian, there's been no updates on. So that's the one that I think is, I asked about it a couple days ago, and JJ just kind of laughed and was like, no update. So that one, I'm like, and they just released Quincy Oliveri as a 2-way guy, added Trey Jemison from New Orleans. He's a big 6'11", 270 pound, physical monster. So that to me could be a sign that between him and Koloko, that they're more looking at some younger, cheaper options at the backup 5 spot. But I think Christian Wood for now, it's that one's on the back burner. But Vando, it seems like he could be back within the next couple of weeks, which would obviously be a much needed infusion to this group.
That's always where I'm at with the backup center thing, especially if you can have a couple of different types. Like if you have this big bruising guy, and then you've got more of like the running athlete in Christian Koloko or Jackson Hayes. Like I think the gap between a 2-way backup center and a backup center that you see traditionally throughout the league is like one of the smaller gaps that you'll see in the league. Whereas like the gap between like a backup point guard and a 2-way point guard feels like a chasm, right? Like the gap between like the Jalen Hood-Schifino types and a D'Angelo Russell or a Tyus
That's
Jones
a big
type,
gap.
You know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think like a Christian Koloko type could come closer to a Bobby Portis in terms of overall 2-way impact, just because he's just going to play hard and he's big and he's athletic and he's going to do all these really basic things. Okay, let's talk about the trade market a little bit. Let's start on the playmaker side of things. If there is a specific type of guy that, like a specific guy that you prefer, let us know. And then among the guys that you've heard mentioned with the Lakers, talk to us about where the Lakers prioritize them. Actually, let me pitch you a really quick one. Do you think it's 100% chance the Lakers make another deal?
No. I would not put it at 100%. I would put it at, let's say, 65%. I think it's more likely than not that they make another deal. But as I hinted at a little bit earlier, the recent intel I've been getting is that they are more likely to do a smaller deal with 1 or 2 second-round picks than actually using a first-round pick, or let alone both first-round picks. I think part of that is the market right now. If you look at the types of guys that have moved, it's been those like fringe starter, high-level bench guys, the Schroeders, DFS, D'Lo, Nick Richards. So I think there will be better players that move around the deadline, but right now teams are really hesitant to move first-round picks in general. Now, I don't agree with that strategy. I think if you're the Lakers, like we've talked about it several times over the past year, you got to go for it. You have 18 months potentially with LeBron and AD left, and I think you need to make the most of it, put the picks on the table, go take a bigger swing. But the recent intel I've heard, it seems to be trending toward them leaning more toward making a smaller deal than a bigger one.
Okay, so let's start with these bigger swings. Well, actually, are there any playmakers out there that you view as a smaller swing? Like, let's say Collin Sexton, for example. Is there anybody in that boat that you think they're exploring?
I think Lonzo is someone that's going to be on their radar. And I think depending on the price, if you could get him for a second or 2 seconds, I think that's an interesting swing. And also someone with that 6'6" frame that could potentially, I think, be similar to Bruce Brown, check a couple of boxes where he can, he's bulked up a little bit throughout his career. So he can guard, I think, twos and even some smaller threes, and potentially be part of like a 1 through 3 switching scheme. And then offensively, I think especially if you're just coming off the bench as a secondary ball handler, playmaker, and also a spot up shooter, like I think he is someone who's an interesting gamble for them. So I would look at kind of the hybrid guys like a Bruce Brown or a Lonzo Ball, or a couple guys that I've reported on that have been linked to them, having Collin Sexton and Malcolm Brogdon. So in either instance, I mean, those guys are making a little bit more money, so you probably have to include Rui. I don't see the Lakers being able to put Jared Vanderbilt in any of these deals without including a first round pick to attach with him. So that kind of limits. Like right now, I think the biggest thing for them is just the contracts are really tough, where people don't want Gabe Vincent's contract. Rui is very much eye of the beholder type asset, and then Jared Vanderbilt has 3 more years left, and the salary figure isn't that bad, but that's still a lot for a guy who's basically been injured for 2 years, and teams are reluctant to take on that type of money. So I would look at those 4 as potential guys, that 2 of them more wing or big guard types that can check a couple boxes, and then 2 of them the more traditional backup slash off guard in Sexton and Brogdon.
Yeah, Lonzo Ball is an interesting option. I actually think he'd be a fantastic fit alongside Austin. I think he's a good defender. I think he plays hard and competes for loose balls. I think he's a more natural offensive fit with everybody, because he's a guy that can knock down catch and shoot jump shots. Is really good, like connective passer. Like he is like Austin in that regard, where when he's driving closeouts, he's so good at like making that next play. And there's a lot of good there. I just am so freaked out about Lonzo's health. It just feels like such a gamble for a guy. Like there's health conversations around guys that I think are somewhat unfair. Like sometimes like guys like Cam Johnson or Zach LaVine. Like Zach LaVine, like, yeah, he had a bad year last year. He played 77 games a year before, and in the 5 years before, he averaged like 67 games played or 65 games played or something like that. Like, there's that, and then there's the I haven't touched a basketball in years thing with Lonzo Ball, right? And like that's where it gets a little freaky for me. I'm kind of out on Malcolm Brogdon because it's like injury concerns, and I just don't think he's particularly great on either end of the ball. The reason why I am partial to the Bruce Brown thing is I think that the Lakers struggle with ball pressure in a way that is separate from some of their half-court shot creation stuff. Like, I think when they get pressured and they don't get into their offense until later in the clock, they can get stagnant and things can fall apart. But when they get the ball up the floor and they run their stuff, I feel like they do okay. And one of the things that Bruce Brown did for Denver for ages, it wasn't like he was, quote unquote, running the offense. He would just bring the ball up the floor and make the high post entry to Jokic, and then they would go play their game. And so Bruce has a unique ability to just like grab and go that allows you to deal with ball pressure in the backcourt and get the ball up the floor and get into your offense. And so I think that's why Bruce remains my favorite option, because he brings a bunch of different characteristics to the table that accentuate the team. Like, he's a good rebounder. This team is desperate for guys that are good rebounders, can handle ball pressure and bring the ball up the floor, something this team desperately needs. The catch and shoot thing can get a little tricky, but like, I don't know about you guys, but when I was watching Max and Cam just brick every open 3 in the Spurs game, I wasn't exactly out there thinking like, oh, but Bruce can't shoot either. Like an upgrade's an upgrade at the end of the day. Collin Sexton's an interesting option. I think he represents a middle ground in a lot of ways, because he, one, has like legit offensive upside. 2, he competes on defense as a ball pressure guy. 3, he's at a more achievable salary. And 4, you could kind of envision a scenario where he could be that 5th guy at times, where on certain nights it makes sense to go Austin, Collin, DFS, LeBron, AD. But then, like, if the matchups are different, you can go to a different guy at that 2-guard spot. But he also could anchor bench units. Like, oh, Austin's out for a night. Well, Collin can scale into a role like that. Like, if Austin misses a game at some point this season, what the hell are the Lakers going to do in terms of guard ball handling? Like, I get it that Austin plays all the time.
It's not Shake Milton, as we saw last night.
Good God. Yeah, exactly. So I think Collin, there's a deal that I kind of like was looking at where it's like, what if you did something with Utah where you got Kessler and Sexton, and you did something with the pick protections from the original D'Lo trade? Do you think that deal is anywhere near the top of the Lakers' radar? That sort of deal?
Those are both guys that they've had interest in. I reported on, they had some extensive talks with Utah before the season for Kessler. The biggest hurdle right now is just the asking price. Utah wants 2 first-round picks for Walker Kessler, and that's not factoring in the potential inclusion of Collin Sexton in a deal. I will say, if the Lakers are willing to include Rui in such a deal, which right now they do value Rui a lot and view him as a longer term piece, but I think for the right deal that they would be willing to include him. You could do something like Rui, JHS, and Christian Wood with a first round pick. You could remove the protections. You could even throw in a pick swap or a couple seconds if they really want additional draft assets for Walker Kessler and Collin Sexton. And on the Lakers side, obviously you're getting Sexton and Kessler, but you're saving $2 million on your tax sheet this year, so that's good for them. But then longer term for Utah, you're actually saving some money next year because JHS and Christian Wood are expiring contracts, and Rui makes less than Kessler and Sexton combined. So in terms of getting the draft capital,
you got to pay Kessler if you keep him,
and you got to pay, and yeah. So I think that like, in theory, is something that makes sense. It just kind of comes back to the asking price. And I guess I'm more willing to give up both first round picks if I'm getting both of those guys. Like I do like, we could talk individual guys, but there are some potential packages out there of a Sexton Kessler, a Bruce Brown, Jakob Poeltl, and to a much lesser extent, at least from my perspective, Malcolm Brogdon, Jonas Valanciunas, and all those pairings are realistic from a salary perspective. The Lakers can mix and match basically Rui and Gabe as the starting point, and then depending on how many other salaries they have to put in to match. But I think those are all, again, Brogdon, Valanciunas, I'm not as sold on those two guys, but especially the other two, Poeltl and Brown, or Kessler and Sexton. If you can get those types of guys, those types of duos back, I think that checks a couple of boxes, and potentially, depending on who you're sending out, just kind of reshuffles this group and add some size, add some defensive versatility, and I just think makes them a more viable playoff threat.
Yeah, the one thing I would say if they did get a Collin Sexton is I would that's where I would turn around and I'd explore looking at something that's on the side for a guy like a Josh Green, where I would still be concerned about not having the perfect 2 for closing games. Because I keep thinking about the final 5. Like, my basketball philosophy centers around the 5 first and goes out from there. And that's why I think Rui has to be included in any deal that if Rui is the asking price in a deal that brings back a player that is in that 5, then I think you got to do it. Because to me, Rui is not in that 5. He's in that 5 some nights, but he's not in that 5 every night. Like, Austin is, LeBron is, AD is. Who's it going to be in the 2-3 when it's pivotal game 2, you're down 1-0 on the road in OKC, it's 95-95 with 5 minutes left. Who do you have out there? That concept to me is like, there needs to be a more high floor option than what they have on the roster right now. And that's why I would look at in that direction if they made that sort of deal. But the Sexton Kessler Edwards deal is an interesting deal to me on a bunch of levels, because I think it's a massive regular season floor raiser in terms of like your ability to sit Anthony Davis for a game, or your ability to sit LeBron or Austin for a game. I think it's going to be difficult to overcome that at this point without that type of deal. Before we move on to the role player core, is there a So is Zach LaVine completely off the table?
I wouldn't say completely off the table, but from a salary matching perspective, it's really hard. Like one of the only negatives in my opinion of the deal, like I think there's two clear negatives from the D'Lo trade, and one was obviously the hit in playmaking that they've taken. But the second thing is just from a salary matching perspective, any bigger trade was likely going to have to require D'Lo both for the actual salary number of just under 19 million, but also he's the only double-digit salary that they have that's expiring. So if you are giving up, a lot of salary, you don't want to necessarily be taking back Rui, Gabe, Vando, and having all those guys on the books next season, and then in Vando's case, 2 more years after that. So because then the asking price kind of changes of some of these guys who don't necessarily have value. It's one thing if you're giving up expiring contracts or semi-valuable contracts, but once you start giving up salary that teams don't want back in return for salary that they don't want, they're going to start asking for stuff that the Lakers aren't going to want to give up. So I wouldn't say he's off the table entirely. My reservation with it is you talk about the closing five, and like I just have concerns about a Zach LaVine, Austin Reeves backcourt defensively when it comes down to it. And I think if you go the Zach LaVine route, I almost wonder if you have to consider moving Austin at that point, either probably not in that deal, maybe in a separate deal to get something else back. But I almost feel like you have to kind of restructure your entire top of the roster and like the hierarchy of it, just because I feel like Zach LaVine and Austin, it's a better version of the Austin D'Lo situation, but there's still similar concerns of, I think Zach, like we've never really seen him in high stakes games. So that's kind of its own thing, but I think teams will target him. He's improved defensively, but he's still a glaring minus. And I don't know how he fits into this roster from like a team defense perspective when we just haven't really seen it from him in big moments. So that would be my concern with that, of just what that looks like and what that fit is, and then potentially having to pivot and go in a different direction. So I think between some of the big names out there, I like Brandon Ingram more than Zach LaVine. I also think Ingram, I know, is not like he profiles as a better defender than he actually is, but at least like I think he can fit off the ball a little bit cleaner. And he also is 6'8", 6'9". So like he has a certain level of length and athleticism out there that if you can find a way to channel it, I think he could be, and I mean this in a positive way, but like a better version of Rui, like a much higher version of Rui. And that's something that I think could fit in that closing five.
Yeah, every time I watch Zach LaVine play, I have my basketball fan in me that gets super excited about what it would look like if he was playing alongside LeBron and AD. But then every time I follow it through to fruition, I just get immediately off board in terms of all the other holes that it opens up. And to your point, there's a version of it where you make several moves and it kind of pieces together into a new team. But now you've got a brand new team, and it just involves a great deal of risk. And that's before we even get into the injury stuff, which, like I said, is I think a little overblown with LaVine. But there's just been enough knee issues over the years that it's worth mentioning. Brandon Ingram was going to be the next guy I brought up. He's a more achievable salary point, but it opens up the same sort of issue in terms of like, okay, but now what are you doing at the 2? Let me just pitch it to you like this. Do you think the Lakers are seriously exploring a Brandon Ingram trade, or do you think that's more in the Zach LaVine territory?
I think it's more in the Zach LaVine territory, but I think he's someone that, depending on the price, they would have interest in. But to your point, it does, like, you've already made the move for DFS, and theoretically you're not trying to shop him or reduce it. Like, you want a certain role for him as either a starting level guy or closing level guy, a big piece of your rotation. Can you go Brandon Ingram DFS on the wings? I guess in theory, but like there are going to be certain matchups that really test your foot speed and lateral quickness there, and just your ability to contain the ball. So Ingram and DFS in theory could work, but I think that they're going to be tested in terms of their perimeter quickness, lateral agility, and just ability to contain the ball. And I think from a salary perspective, like it is much easier to make him work. As you mentioned, he's in the mid 30s, so you can get there with Rui and Gabe. You're at about 29, and then you throw in a couple minimum guys. Maybe they take on a JHS as like a low stakes gamble or something. But that one's more, I think, realistic just from making it work. Once you get into the 40s with guys like Zach LaVine, guys like Jimmy Butler, I think that's where the Lakers just don't really have the matching salary.
So I agree when it comes to the other big salary guys. Like, I'm out on like a Jimmy Butler trade or a Zach LaVine trade. If you called David Griffin and you could get Brandon Ingram, I think you do it. I just think it's such a talent play for a team that does have a talent deficiency. And there's some things you like you talked about, like that's not a team you talk about a team that would need to switch. That team would need to switch. That's a team that would need to switch, contain, double, and rotate. And even then it would be difficult. But like, I think there's enough talent there to at least consider it as a play. All right. We only have a couple more minutes, so I want to do rapid fire style. I'm just going to hit you with some names. I just want you to, as best as you can, just guess a percentage chance that this guy is a Laker after the deadline. We'll start with Bruce Brown.
35%.
Let's go Walker Kessler.
25%.
Collin Sexton.
20%.
Let's go Brandon Ingram.
We'll say 18%.
Lonzo Ball.
Ooh. 32%.
Okay. Let's two more. We'll go Malcolm Brogdon.
15%.
Josh Green.
30%.
Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anyone that I'm missing. Let's try like another backup center like Robert Williams.
We'll say 22%.
Okay. All right. So it sounds to me like
I'm going relatively conservative here.
Yeah, for sure. No, I got you. So it sounds to me like they're still kind of just exploring all these options and they're not really committed and they're going to make this decision as like a right at the deadline kind of thing.
Yes, that is my understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, Jovan, tell us about what you got going on over at your channel before we get out of here.
Yeah, so please check out Buha's block and my channel, Jovan Buha, on YouTube. Also, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. And then also be sure to subscribe to The Athletic to read all my work and my reporting on the Lakers trade deadline and where this team is at the midseason point.
Great stuff as always, man. It was good to see you as well. That's all we have for today. We'll be back tomorrow with our usual Friday mailbag. We will see you guys then.